that we've reviewed our decimals and how those work, how we read and write them, we are going to jump into writing them, representing them on a number line. So here for today, we are going to represent decimals up to hundredths on number lines. Our key point: decimals are just like fractions. Decimals that end in the tenth place are like fractions over 10. And decimals that end in the hundredths place are like fractions over 100. Now we have some examples of what that might look like. A decimal, let's say 0.1, so that'd be 0 and 1/10. 10 places the first one after the decimal places. That would equal 1/10 in fraction form. Now if I change that slightly, that's our tenths and our hundredths place, this would then give me 1/100th. Remember, this is much smaller. If I asked you if you wanted 10 cents versus 1 cent, I'm sure you would choose 10 cents. This is 1/10 of a dollar. This is a dime. This is 1 penny, 1/100th of a dollar. Let's look at another example or two. We could do something like, let's say if we had 3.4. Now this is a little more complicated because it's mixed. It has a whole number as well as a decimal. That's 3 and 4/10. We would write it 3 and 4/10. Now if I switch that just slightly, moving each number over, that's 0 and 34 hundredths. So we have tenths and hundredths. Remember, this decimal place is very important. Would you rather have $3.40 or 34 cents? The numbers are the same, but the decimal place, or the decimal point, is in a different place. So in this case, we would write it 34 hundredths. There is no whole number. We have 0 and 34 hundredths. So you can get 34 pennies, or you can get $3.40. Here are our how steps. First, we decide which two integers are on either side of your decimal. This means the whole numbers on either side. We've looked at problems before where we had a 2, but we knew that the 2 would be too small. Our number was going to be in between 2 and 3 because it was 2 and then a fractional amount. An example could be like this. It's bigger than 3, and the next number would be 4, so this would be between 3 and 4. So to decide which two integers are on either side of your decimal, divide the space between them into 10 spaces for your tenths. Do you have hundredths? Decide which two tenths are on either side of your decimal. Divide the space between them into 10 spaces for your hundredths. We are not going to ask you to divide a whole line into 100 pieces. That is too much. It's going to take too long, and it's not necessary. If we remember here, I'll just put it this way so I can fit it quickly. These are tenths. These are hundredths. So if I divide this into 10 pieces, then that would give me hundredths. And I can do the same thing by just dividing one of them into hundredths. Our first example, in our final step, place a dot where the decimal should be. Now let's look at some problems. Our first problem is example 1. Ben is traveling from his house to the store. He has traveled 45 hundredths of the distance. Draw an arrow to show where Ben is located. How much farther does Ben have to go? Now I know here, because I know these are tenths and these are hundredths, that I'm going to have to divide my line, at least part of it, into hundredths. Now remember, this is easier to do. We don't have to write 100 lines, but what we will do is divide this into, like it says here, 10 spaces for our tenths. So let's start. And I'm trying to think about the easiest way for me to do this. I think if I divide it in half, and then divide each of these into 5. That will give me what I want. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces. And 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So on this line, I've now created 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 spaces. They should be exactly the same. Because I drew them by hand, they're not. But we know that they represent equal parts. Each of them is 1/10. Now, because we have hundreds, we need to divide. Oh, and you know what I did forget? I forgot to recognize which two integers are on either side of my decimal. So in this case, we have 0, because we don't have a whole number right here, so already there's a 0. And the next integer up would be 1. So we are looking at something between the value of 0 and 1. Now, I skipped ahead and did step 2. We've divided our line into tenths. Now, because I have hundredths right here, I need to decide which 2 tenths are on either side of your decimal, or my decimal in this case. And to help me with this, I'm going to actually label them. We have 0 and 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, 4/10, 5/10, 6/10, 7/10, 8/10, and 9/10. And then one more tenth makes a whole. Now I know 45, if I'm thinking about my numbers, is in between 40 and 50, and so it's going to be similar here. It's in between 4/10 and 5/10. I'm going to then divide this section into 10. Now this is going to be even smaller. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You'll notice I only have to draw 4 lines to make the 5 pieces, because I already drew this line, and this line already was there. Okay, now I'm going to place the dot where the decimal should be. So we have 4/10. We've marked that here. This is my starting point. I then need to add 5/100ths. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5/100ths. And Mr. Johnston said place a dot where the decimal should be. So this is where our value might be. And Mr. Johnston might have you put that on the line. Because my lines are so big, I don't think it would be very clear. But this is where I'm going to put my dot. We have one more problem that we'll do together, and then you'll be able to work on the practice problems on your own. Our second example. What could the star on this number line represent in decimals? Now, in this problem, it doesn't tell us very much. All it does is give us a number line, which is really nice because it's already set up, so I can go ahead and number it. I have 0 here and 1 here, so those are the integers that are on either side of my decimal. It's already divided into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 pieces. I guess I'm going to have hundredths to some extent because this is in between 2 tenths. So I'm going to label it first. So we have 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, 4/10, 5/10, 6/10, 7/10, 8/10, and 9/10, and then my whole number 1. Now I know this is going to start with 0.6 because it's not quite 7/10, but it is 6/10. And now because it's right in the middle, I'm going to guess that my hundredths then would be 5. This might be a little bit off. It might be 64 hundredths. It might be 66 hundredths, but I think it looks like it's right in the middle. I think that makes sense to call it 65 hundredths. Now I realized we actually have one more example problem that I will pull up before I set you on your own. It says draw a number line that shows where 2 and 65 hundredths is located. This is a little bit more difficult and will take a little bit more time than what we've been doing. Now if you remember from our fraction work, when I set up my number line, because this has a whole number, I am going to mark those numbers on here as well, leading up to that number. So we have 0, 1, 2, and 3. I'll stop at 3 because this is smaller than 3, but it's bigger than 2. So that's why I included 3 on my number line. Now, I need to draw a number line to show where this is located. And I've decided already, like I noted, that it's in between 2 and 3. Bigger than 2, because it's 2 and 65 hundredths, but smaller than 3. My first step after that is to divide the space into tens for my tenths. So again, I'm going to put a halfway mark, and then 4 lines to, I'm going to spread those apart a little bit further, because that was too small. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tenths. And do the same thing on this side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more tenths. I'll go ahead and label those 1 tenth, 2 tenths, 3 tenths. It's getting very crowded, so I'm going to make this one a little bit higher up and a little bit bigger because that's a halfway mark. It's kind of important. 5 tenths, 6 tenths, 7 tenths, 8 tenths, 9 tenths, and then that gives us to 3. And I realized I just made a small mistake. These are not 0 and 1 tenths. These are all 2 and 2 tenths, 2 and 3 tenths, 2 and 4 tenths, 2 and 5 tenths, 2 and 6 tenths, 2 and 7 tenths, 2 and 8 tenths, and 2 and 9 tenths. Had I written those down here, then that would have been fine. But I need to include the whole number. 2 and 1 tenth, 2 and 2 tenths, 3 tenths, 4 tenths, 5 tenths, and so on. Now I have to decide, because I have hundredths, right here are my hundredths, tenths, hundredths, which 2 tenths are on either side of my decimal. Now, because this is a sixth, I know it's going to be starting here, but because it's bigger than that, it's going to be in between 2 sixths and 2 sevenths. Now, I now need to divide this space into 10. Now that's going to be kind of difficult, but one of the nice things is that I have 5 tenths here. So I can make that middle line, and really that's it. But to be consistent, I'm going to divide this into my 10, and see, it's very, very hard because I made it so small. But I know that 5 is half, and so that's halfway. And so this, with my dot, is where I would mark 2 and 65 tenths. Remember, we've included these 2 whole numbers on our number line, but we didn't need to divide those up because this decimal is in between 2 and 3. So the remaining problems are for you to try, and you have several sheets. I would encourage you to leave your partner practice until tomorrow, but you can definitely start working on your independent practice.